This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. Today is a special episode where we're inviting you to join our book club discussion. On the Adoptees On Patreon community, we have book club not quite every month, so folks can try and keep up with the reading, but almost. I'm thrilled to share this conversation with you. Our host today is Sullivan Summer, who you may remember was a guest on episode 211 of the podcast. Sullivan interviews Rebecca Carroll, author of Surviving the White Gaze, as a live event with fellow adoptees. This was recorded in October of 2022. Before we get started, I wanted to invite you to join our Patreon book club over on adopteeson.com/book club, which helps support you and also the show to support more adoptees around the world. And you can hear more of our book club conversations just like this one. Let's listen in. Welcome back to Adoptees Off Script. I'm Haley Radke, and with me today is Sullivan Summer. Welcome, Sullivan.
Hi, Haley. It's so good to see you again.
Yes, I'm so excited. We have book club today with the tremendous Rebecca Carroll, author of Surviving the White Gaze, which was our book club pick for this month. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We are in an adoptee-only space today, so if you are not an adoptee, we'll ask you to listen to the recording later. But Sullivan has prepared a wonderful interview for us today, and we're really excited to get started. If you have comments or questions, you can pop those in the chat, and I will, mention a few of them. But welcome here. Excited to chat about your book.
And as Haley said, Rebecca, we are so excited to have you here this afternoon. And so for folks that are not maybe as familiar, Rebecca, with you and your work. So Rebecca is a podcast host of Come Through. And more recently, Billy Was a Black Woman, which was a companion podcast to the Lee Daniels film, The United States versus Billie Holiday, which I would say go watch that if you've not watched it already. She's the author of Saving the Race, Conversations on Du Bois from a Collective Memoir of Souls, Uncle Tom or New Negro, which is one I have on my bookshelf, African Americans Reflect on Booker T. Washington and Up from Slavery 100 Years Later, Sugar and the Raw, Voices of Young Black Girls in America, and the reason we are here today, Surviving the White Gaze, which came out last year, which is about your experience as a domestic transracial adoptee growing up in rural New Hampshire. And so, Rebecca, I know you have a ton of experience podcasting and in the media and being on Trevor Noah's show and those kinds of things. As Haley said, though, you are with an audience of 100% adoptees. And so I have seen you and heard you enough times to know that you are not a person that necessarily pulls punches when you share your opinion. But I would say of all the safe spaces in the world, this is probably the safest space in the world to just, share whatever it is that you're thinking or feeling or want to make sure that other adoptees hear as well. So we are thrilled to have you. And I would love, if you're game, Rebecca, I would love to just jump right in with both feet.
Does that sure.
sound okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And so reading, of course, your book was just phenomenal. And you are someone that certainly resonates with me, and your story resonates with me, as I am also a Black transracial adoptee from rural New Hampshire. One thing I thought was really interesting, though, is your full name is Rebecca Simone Carroll. Simone was the name you were given at birth. And please.
Let me just pause there for a moment.
Absolutely.
My full name is Rebecca Ann Carroll.
Oh, okay.
I have used Simone off and on, about which I feel tremendously ambivalent, because it is, my birth mother, Tess, a white woman, tells this very romantic story of having gone to see Nina Simone with her mother, who was failing in mental health, and either when she was pregnant with me or just before. And she really cherishes this memory. And so that when she gave birth to me, she gave me the name Simone after Nina Simone. And so, as you know from reading the book, after we reunited when I was 11, I was desperate to gain her love and acceptance. And so I thought I would try out Rebecca Simone and see if that worked. And she would call me that from time to time, and my heart would melt. But it never really stuck, and I'm glad that it didn't properly, particularly because it was a name given to me by a white woman who later tried to appropriate and refute and literally erase my Blackness. And so it's in my website just because Rebecca Ann Carroll, I think, was either taken or, a name. Names are really tricky, I think, for us. I've never felt attached to Rebecca either. I've never felt attached to Rebecca Carroll. I mean, there's this whole, when I got married, it was like politically or personally, like, I'm just not interested in taking my husband's name. I gave it to my son because I did everything else, frankly. But I thought about, the idea of changing my name to his last name. I don't feel any kind of attachment in any kind of way in particular, except when my friends and my family call me my name.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca, because you actually went exactly where I was going to go, which is you were named after quite frankly, a Black civil rights icon, but named by a white woman in an all white area. Would people have I didn't know who Nina Simone was growing up. Would people have even known anything about that anyway?
I think ultimately it's neither here nor there because, the only Black folks that my white adoptive parents, who then named me after my father's mentor's youngest daughter, Rebecca Ann Miller, they only knew Martin Luther King. I mean, it was really neither here nor there, and which goes to tell you that knowing one or knowing two doesn't actually change the parenting in a healthy or useful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we say sort of, all white area. I love data. So I pulled the data. So you grew up in Warner, New Hampshire. And I found this great articulation of the data based on the 2020 census. It said based on the 2020 census, there were 10.8 times as many white residents as any other ethnicity in Warner in 2020, which again, I'm guessing it's probably more diverse now than it was when you were growing up.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know about that. Okay. More diverse. I think that's probably subjective. But, when I was writing the book, my husband, who is a sociology professor and also is a fan of stats and data, we were like, I couldn't have been the only Black person in Warner, New Hampshire. And it turns out I was. I became the first Black person in Warner, New Hampshire in 1969. So yeah, that's pretty wild. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but to make that choice as white parents of a Black child is still kind of blows my mind a little bit.
When you say that choice, what do you mean that choice?
Oh, hey, what a cool idea to raise a Black kid where there's no other Black people day in, day out, because this is what works for us. This is what works for us. Mm-hmm. I get that. Nobody's saying to my dad that he can't love nature or the natural world or need to be around that, but maybe either A, think twice about adopting a child of color, specifically a Black child, or B, get a plan together where I can actually be around Black folks.
Did you ever get that? Well, but you were born there, like shrug. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, what were they supposed to do? Like that you were born in that area generally.
Right. No, I don't get that, but because I also wasn't born certainly in Warner. I was born in New Hampshire, but I was born in a part of New Hampshire that actually had claimed a small Black population at least. But no, I've not gotten that. And I also feel like, again, neither here nor there, which is this, I really do think we have to be clear that the responsibility falls with the parents. It really, it's basically, if you have children, bio or otherwise, or adopted or however, your job, it's like your only job is to make sure that these human beings are mentally, emotionally, culturally cared for and have a relationship with themselves, a kind of self-awareness that prepares them for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we dive into some of what you wrote in the book, it right near the beginning, your adoptive father says it wasn't a problem that your biological father was Black. In fact, he said, if anything, the idea of adopting a child of another race had great appeal for us. And I was curious about two things in there. That the words not a, well, it's not really a problem, and the words appealing. And can you talk a little bit about how that is sort of how that feels of either race is either not a problem or it's appealing?
I think that I want to find where, because I wrote some notes here, right? Okay. So, and you asked if the story had changed over time, like, or if my feelings about the story had changed over time.
Yeah.
And I always found it confusing, but it's definitely changed over time, which is when, of course, when he first told it to me, I was like, oh, cool. Like, you wanted to add an element of cultural difference to the family. But of course, over the years, it was clear that the appeal for them was more aesthetic. It was more about aesthetics than culture, a sort of curatorial effort, really, and whether that is because they are artists themselves or not, I don't know. I do know that it was a vision, that it was something that my dad wanted to see and not do, because certainly he didn't spend any time, he or my family didn't spend any time making an effort to learn about my Blackness, Black culture, writ large, Blackness for themselves. And they never deferred to me on the matter of my Blackness. And I think too that is a thing for white adoptive parents. We have all of these sort of catchphrases in play, good intentions and the language about gratitude and this and that. And my mom would say, oh, people kept telling us we were doing such a good thing, but we didn't think of it that way at all. But of course you did. Of course you did. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't have done it if you hadn't.
Mm-hmm. Around the same time when you're sort of talking about these stories that you were told as a child, another thing that you say is that your birth father seemed less important in the overall telling of your story. And you say, since your adoptive parents didn't have a relationship with him. And is that something you continue to think about? I'm curious about, was it because, well, they didn't have a relationship? Well, fathers are sometimes take sort of the back seat to mothers, or is it because your father was Black and not white and therefore less important?
Totally. I mean, Black men are systematically set up to fail in America, period. And this is no exception. My white mother, birth mother, and her family decided that he would be cut out of the picture. They made that decision. He told me that. She told me that. And so my white adopted parents said, we deferred to her, to Tess, to make that decision, and we respected her decision. Not thinking this Black man could bring real value to our daughter's life. I mean, no matter the circumstances, he had a very difficult life. The cards were stacked against him and are stacked against a lot of Black men, but he was certainly the kind of epitome of disenfranchised. He grew up in government housing and foster care and wasn't really able to find a career path that worked, and he loved to be seen. He was really sophisticated, but he didn't have any grounding. And so, the one thing that would ground him, I mean, can you imagine after all of these years of sort of not knowing? And I think about it all the time, particularly when in the moment in the book, when Kofi sees that picture of me when I was little, he said, "Mommy, why I'm holding a frog?" The moment the way that resonated with me, I think so often it gives me goosebumps thinking about it, that my birth father probably would have felt that same way. And when he died in the service program, the person who wrote the notes said he cherished the memory of a daughter. Yeah. So I think it had everything to do with his race.
So thank you for that first. And I think that's something that certainly resonated with me as well, because my father was Black and my mother was white. And I was led to believe my father was a drug addict.
I'm sure
and
you were.
It was not until well into adulthood where I thought maybe, or he was just a Black man in the 70s.
Or he was just a Black man in the 70s. I mean, people love to do that whole thing, right? I mean, for those of you who follow me on Twitter, you know that I, from time to time, will say something about adoption, transracial adoption, and people just lose their minds when Black or brown or adoptees say anything about their experience and their coming into their own agency. And they love to say things like, well, your Black, parents were probably stupid and drug addicts and in jail and didn't want you and all these kinds of things. And it's just, my skin is so thick at this point that I tend to think that that's even, to be able to have that out there is really important for people to see, because that's how limited our understanding of adoption is.
Along these same lines, and I'm skipping around in the book some, and I should probably shout out page numbers for people that want to go back and find them. But so I'm way down on page 276. Your mother said, "You came out of my body and I am white. So there's no way that you're going to go around calling yourself Black." And can you talk a little bit about where does that attitude come from? And quite frankly, Rebecca, is it worth your time even to think about it?
Well, I appreciate that you said, is it worth my time? I don't know that it's worth my time. I think it might be worth our time. I think there's another part of questioning where you asked about my parents' racism, both Tess and my parents' racism, and how did I feel about that? With my parents, my instinct was to protect them, which is like, well, they don't know the nuances of racism. They don't know how they're being racist. And I don't want them to feel bad. I mean, that instinct went away fairly quickly after the book came out. But I don't feel that way about Tess at all, because she is the garden variety, like the regular white supremacist racist. I mean, she really is that person who uses racism as a way to control, as a power differential, as a way to make somebody feel badly, as a way to assert her significance, her supremacy. And so I didn't know that when she said it. All I knew is that it felt like I literally like being hit by a train. Like, it was one of the most resonant moments of my life. And it really, I would not say, I've talked about this a lot and wrote about it in the book. I did not necessarily have suicidal ideation. I did know that I did not want to feel what I felt. And that Corinne, in that moment, my girlfriend, who is my dear, dear sister, and to this day, she came and said, you've got to, we need you. We need to keep you in the world. There's too much for you to do. And it's no small thing that it was a Black woman who said that to me. It's no small thing that she took my hand in hers, and that I saw this coming from a Black woman. But yeah, that moment was pretty intense.
I did read Tess's book to research. I was shocked by the racism in it. And maybe I shouldn't have been. I was shocked. I
have not read that book in 20 years. And so I would actually be interested to hear what racism you identified in the book.
The pieces that were most resonant for me was actually the way she talked about your father.
My birth father?
Yes, your birth father.
Yes.
Your birth father.
Yes.
Yeah. The strapping Black buck who's a sex machine.
There it is.
Yeah. And that it was easier or better for her to date Black men because they weren't intimidated by her sexuality. Because again, all they want is sex. So,
you're bringing me back. Okay.
And I think what was most shocking, and again, it probably shouldn't have been, what was most shocking is this is a person who I believe is the same type of person who would stand up and say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. In fact, I'm the least racist person you know. Right.
In fact, verbatim, she has said that.
Yeah. I'm not shocked at all. But it was so just, it could not have been any more clear in the book, in her book, and some of that language. And I was pretty floored.
Yeah, I remember, and we are estranged now, but I do remember trying to hold her accountable a couple of times. And her response was the same thing that people say about Gone with the Wind or whatever. It's like, that's what people were saying, right? No, that's what people were getting away with saying, right? And but she will, I don't think, ever see beyond her own. That's that's the beauty of narcissism, is that you're always right. I mean, narcissists choose their pathology well.
Mm-hmm. Her aside, again, I know you no longer live in New Hampshire. You live in New York. You live in New York City now. But I'm curious about, thinking back to your upbringing, and you have a different lens now, and you have a more mature lens, and how do you parse that line between, it was the time, it was just the time, versus accountability?
Yeah, I go straight to accountability. I don't believe at all that it's about that was then, this is now. We can start there if you'd like, but as I just said, It wasn't that people were saying that and it was fine, or that it wasn't racist. People were saying racist things and getting away with it. Yeah. People were saying racist things because people who could call them on it felt disenfranchised, felt like we would, you start wherever you want, would be lynched, would be fired, would be, shut out, whatever the punishment is. Those of us who had the expertise on what that language was, were disenfranchised for accountability. Now, if any progress has been made, it's that we can call things out, not without, that a punishment, because clearly, again, point to Twitter, and that's not even half of what you see. I mean, I get the kind of hate spew all the time in DMs and whatnot. But I feel like we have to go straight to accountability, because otherwise it's a disservice. It's such a disservice to progress and to young people trying to understand history.
Another one of the more resonant parts I found in the book is, and this is on page 148, and this is when you are graduating from high school and you're sort of figuring out what's next. And you say, I wanted to get out of New Hampshire and move to New York. And I wanted to be around Black people, but nobody asked me about that. And I didn't know to ask anyone. Nobody suggested an HBCU, something I'd never heard of, or asked how I felt about 17 years in a small rural town engulfed by whiteness, quietly amassing and internalizing moments of targeted racism. Do you ever get resentful about that? I'll tell you, Rebecca, again, I went to a small liberal arts women's college. I didn't know what an HBCU was until I was 21. And I thought, oh my God, I could have gone to Spelman.
I know.
And I didn't know what it was. Like nobody,
Listen,
I didn't know what it was.
It is taking me every last bit of restraint from not just demanding my son go to an HBCU, just outright demanding. He knows what it means and how important it is. And he's definitely applying to Howard. Yeah. I mean, resentful. I really try to be very mindful of the difference between resentment and really being self-actualized and really understanding what I was frankly cheated of, and what I can honestly, authentically mourn. And I think resentment gives too much energy to the folks that kept those things from me, whether knowingly or not.
And you say what I can authentically mourn. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that Blackness and Black culture and Black legacy is such an extraordinary gift, and so rich and so gorgeous, and that I didn't have any access to that as a way to keep myself healthy, emotionally healthy. I mourn that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I feel that.
Yeah.
I hear that. Absolutely. again, to go back to the book, and this is around sort of the same area and the same sort of time in your life. You say, I was Black now, but I'd always been Black. It's just that no one around me ever really saw me. And do you think there's something unique about the transracial adoptee experience in our not being seen? And like, do you think, talk to me a little bit more about that.
Well, we're shepherded by the white gaze, which, we think is going to protect us. But, it's really, really important to enunciate that no matter how hard we try to reintegrate as either whenever it happens, whenever we are allowed to, or gain access to our community, whether it's doing a skit to the Mary Jane Girls, or whether it is in, a student union group, or writing books about Black folks, or finding community Black, no matter how hard we try and how committed we are to trying, there's no getting around the fact that our formative years, and I mean infancy to 5, say, are shepherded by the white gaze. That means the standard of everything, the standard of beauty, the standard of schooling, the standard of morals, moral integrity, all of that is shepherded by the white gaze. So yeah, absolutely. I think that we're not seen, and we're not seen in that context specifically.
Mm-hmm. And you may have been going there when you just said we're not seen in that context specifically. Do you think our white adoptive parents see us differently than they see other Black people?
They do. And I'll give you an example. There are many, but this one stuck out to me because it just does. I remember being in my 20s-ish or so, and my mom and I, it was either a documentary or some kind of thing that was narrated by a Black woman who had this really beautiful voice, resonant voice. And afterwards, my mom said, Black women's voices they're so beautiful. They're just so different. And I remember thinking, like, do you mean your voices? Because I'm a Black woman. There have been numerous examples of that. But so yes, to answer your question, I'm quite certain. And also, there's a proprietary sense. Mm-hmm. White adoptive parents, whether they're willing to admit it or not, took in a child of another color, and they feel a way about that.
Well, and you say take in, and I think for some, myself included, would go one step further, which is purchased.
Yeah.
And I think there is an unwillingness to think about the purchase of a Black child.
I mean, I think one of the really tricky conversations on Twitter around this most recent comment that I made which was about my white parents not being able to understand the value of somebody like Roxane Gay or Kiese Lehman or Damon Young supporting my work. These are fucking brilliant writers, but they can't really understand the value of them because they've never read them. And that if you're not reading these writers, you shouldn't be raising Black children, right? And so people got in their feelings. But one of the conversations that is tricky is this likeness to slavery or chattel slavery, right? Which I don't think is particularly useful. What I do think is the foundational dynamic of white people setting the standard of Black existence. That tracks, that translates. That's absolutely the way that it started. Here's how it started, that white people would decide and make choices for the well-being or not well-being of Black folks. And that is absolutely what transracial adoption is.
Mm-hmm. I know I was re-watching earlier today your interview on Trevor Noah. Again, I had seen it when it first aired. And I'm going to ask you a question that he asked you. And I'm going to ask it again in this audience. And also since it's been about a year, he asked you, should white adoptive parents be adopting non-white children at all? Or Black children at all?
I think, and I don't remember what I said to him, but I feel now, and I think it's been pretty consistent, I feel like no, not unless they're willing to decenter their whiteness, be in real authentic community with Blackness, and that is an immersive experience. And I don't mind, pointing to my white husband who had immersed himself in Black community, Black culture. He's a former DJ, loves music, and has he had more Black friends than I did when we met. And not in a woke way, in a way in which he genuinely felt a sense of compassion and joy. But he knows that he has to be all of that to raise a Black child. That has to be legitimate and authentic. I couldn't have married him if it wasn't, right? But his child is his biological child, but he is willing and able to decenter his own whiteness and consider our family Black, a different kind of Black family, because we are. So do I think that white parents should be, I don't primarily, no, but I think it's possible.
I appreciate that. And I know it's a really hard, it's a thorny, a thorny question too, because, in listening to you, like, hey, listen, they're not, unless they're prepared to do all of this work. And I think about, again, where you and I both grew up. And
I just want to quickly say, I'm sorry to speak over you, but I don't think of it as work. It's not work, right? It's not work. It's existence. It is, that's the problem, I think, is looking at it as labor or work. It's not, unless it becomes labor, Who wants to work at it? Who wants to work at it? This is why and we obviously have had numerous conversations and fights and arguments about this, my husband and I, about what his feelings are and what his relationship is with Blackness and this and that and so on and so forth. But there is also a kind of conversancy that it's a fluency. It's the same fluency that everybody else in America has about whiteness. It's like, why don't you have that? It's not work. It's not, if you ask a white person who, has read Margaret Atwood or watches Game of Thrones or whatever it may be, the case may be, particularly in pop culture, but also being surrounded by it all the time, every day, the default, the white gaze. It's not work to know about all of that.
You saying, hey, let me interrupt you, it's not work, has sort of knocked me speechless in a way that in a way, Rebecca, I wish we were physically together, because I would give you a hug in that way. Because part of me thinks, like, of course you're right. Of course it's, and we shouldn't be using that vernacular, and we shouldn't be using that terminology. And then the other half of me, which again, still myself works every day, to get sort of out of my upbringing, says, well, so much of what you're saying makes sense, when you live in a city. And as you said, you've raised your son in an urban environment where people look like him and it's all around and those kinds of things. Where we grew up, I mean, we can see Black people on television all day long, but it's not there.
Although I think you're probably much younger than me.
Didn't. But, yeah. But could have in theory. And today, certainly. Today, certainly.
Sure.
Could
absolutely.
See. And so, how do you test their readiness, their knowledge, it's almost there's no petri dish, if that makes sense, right? Like Brooklyn is a petri dish.
Right.
For race relations and interactions. New Hampshire is not.
No, it sure is not. I am very, and this is, in part because I'm a writer and a language person, but I'm very wary of the way in which words and phraseology gets co-opted very quickly. So it's like, as you can imagine, there were a lot of friendships with white women that didn't make it through this book. But I have recently been in touch with a friend who our relationship sort of suffered before the book came out. But anyway, she said to me, she's like, I realize now that I have to do the work. And that phrase, I have to do the work, has become, I have a best friend. The new, I have a Black best friend. It's like the way that these, and the danger and peril of something like anti-racism or, the Robin DiAngelo book and Ibram Kendi, who are both very smart people, and I'm glad that their work exists. But the way that it gets snatched up so quickly and actually serves the opposite function, I'm very, very wary of that. So if I meet a white person or a potential prospective white adoptive parent who says to me, I know we have to do the work in order to, be good parents, I don't trust it. I don't trust it at all. So I listen to the way that people have conversations and talk about race and talk about their role in systemic racism. And, it's accountability. It's not asking for it, it's being it. It's having the conversation live inside of accountability as opposed to what would it look like if you were accountable.
So much of your work, really all of your work, is so extensively steeped in Blackness and Black history and those kinds of things. And I'm curious about how, or if you think about how you approach those topics, which is every bit your history as it is mine, as it is any Black person's, versus a Roxane Gay or Kise Lehman or, other Black writer who grew up much more steeped in their own culture than you did. I'm curious about whether or not you think you have a different lens.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's a running joke, right? It's like with certain sets of folks, of certain sets of people, that it's, it's the light-skinned Blacks, it's the mixed race kids who are always really insecure about our cultural and racial identity, whether adopted or not. And, that's very real. I think in the same way that I waited as long as I did to write the memoir, I waited for a certain emotional fortitude, and I also waited for a certain feeling of finally stepping into a Blackness that feels right and comfortable and authentic. But yeah, of course the lens is different. And I know that people are like, oh, here she goes again. She's coming from her place of insecurity because she didn't get what, Blackness when she was raised. And I know that some folks probably think that. I don't particularly care, and I don't think that it's particularly compassionate. But yeah, I know that is a thing. And that was part of the journey. That was part of the arc, right? I remember with Sugar and the Raw writing in the introduction, or maybe it was Saving the Race, I can't remember, but writing about how I was inserting myself into these places of Blackness and spaces of Blackness and starting to feel like I was an intruder, or like I was trying to appropriate my own culture. Nobody told me that it was my culture, that it wasn't appropriation, that it was mine to inhabit. And that again is a failing on the part of too many white adoptive parents.
Yeah. I mean, that certainly appropriating my own culture certainly resonates with me. It's interesting to hear you say that you wrote the book when you felt like you had the fortitude and that you were ready. And again, I fully understand the sort of emotional toll that writing a memoir takes, but it's interesting to hear you say that, because even in your story, as early as high school, anyway, you were very much asserting, even as the only one in the room, very much asserting your Blackness. And so it's interesting to hear you say that it's decades later, you feel like you have the fortitude to write the book.
Yeah, no, I didn't have the context or the language, but I definitely was deeply, deeply aware of the otherness, and I was deeply aware of wanting to get the hell out of there. And I knew that it was all about strategy. It was all about being in the right circle so that I could just get out of there. Whereas my brother and sister, my high school, I don't know if your high school had, the front hall, the back hall. Front hall was the preppies and the good students, and the back hall was the druggies and the bad students. My brother and sister were in the back hall. I was in the front hall all day long. I was going to get the hell out of Dodge. Yeah. So yeah, those two things worked in tandem, but there was a lot of heartbreak. There was a lot of of real deep sadness and questioning and insecurity and all the regular things that teenagers go through anyway, without a whole lot of support.
Mm-hmm. It's now been, the book's been out for 18 months now. Is there anything, like looking back, is there anything that you included in the book that maybe you wish you hadn't, or vice versa, anything that either you left out or your editor was cut that you sort of really wish was there?
No, I have an extraordinary agent. I worked on the proposal for a whole year, and she worked on it with me. She is one of those very rare agents, literary agents, who actually also serves as an editor. And so we worked very hard on the proposal. And then Christine Pride, my editor, really just, I wrote a first draft, and, we talked about what the through line would be. And as soon as we realized, or I realized, that nothing that didn't speak directly to surviving the white gaze would make it in there. So I could have written all like chapters and chapters about my early friendship with Leah, which was really meaningful to me, and we're still friends to this day, and art and the importance of art in my life. I mean, all sorts of things, but it had to stay as directly related to that through line as possible. And so having said that, I don't regret a single word, not a single word. And again, as I said earlier at the start, I waited a long time. I waited not just until I had the emotional fortitude, but the skill. Writing a memoir is hard as really, really hard. And so I waited until I had the skill, and I'm deeply, deeply proud of it.
As well, you should be, for sure. And the number of people that have seen Impress come out and just said, what an amazing book. And I think we all feel that way as well, for sure. I know right after it came out, because you've talked a little bit about this publicly, that your parents didn't necessarily shout from the rooftops, "My daughter wrote a book, everybody go read it." Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah. What's so wild / sad about that is that everybody responded in exactly the way I wrote about them. Mm-hmm. My birth mother wrote letters and emails to my publisher, to venues that I was going to speak at, trying to get me canceled before that term existed. And my mom loved it until my dad didn't. And then she changed her position on it. That is pretty much it, acting in the character which I wrote about them, which is the irony, right? I mean, that is who they are, and that is how they responded. But I didn't anticipate my parents being especially my dad. I did not anticipate him having the reaction that he had. I mean, threatening to sue me is just wild. I had no sense of that. And because I wrote a piece earlier this year about sort of still surviving the white gaze, and my dad and I were super close growing up. So close that my birth mother thought there was this concern, we could go on and on about that. But yeah, I did not, that makes me sad. That does definitely make me sad, but I have a great therapist, so.
Can I ask you one more question about that?
Yeah.
One more hard question about that. And again, you mentioned before, hey, you lost a lot of white friends through writing this book. And I am estranged from my adoptive parents at this point in time for a lot of reasons, including racism.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'm curious about whether, do you think that racism played into their reaction? What I mean, but yeah,
100%.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And that is, that sort of brings us full circle, right? Which is that they don't see it is also racist. That they're unable to put their ego aside is also racist. And that's really tough, because it's like, my dad is one of these Picasso type artists, white artists, male artists who, he's not treacherous. He's not Harvey Weinstein, but he's one of these white male artists of a certain generation who feel like they can lean into being a romantic. And so the idea of adopting a Black child, there's a romance about that he really leaned into. The aesthetic of it, the notion of it, but a lot of that is just racism. Straight up and down.
I found also probably the most resonant part for me in the whole book was a part at the end. You alluded to this part before, in the final pages, you talk about you had gone to visit your family and you had your son, Kofi, with you. And you said on our drive home to Brooklyn, Kofi asked why there was seemingly no evidence in their house that they had raised a Black child. No Black art, books, music, like there was in our home. I mean, it's all like turtles, he said from the back seat. Does that hurt your feelings, Mom? It was not until I read that. And so I've read the book twice now. I read it the week it came out and then reread it. It was so a year and a half ago. It was not till I read that it occurred to me there was no Black anything in the house I grew up. I didn't notice until I read that passage in your book. And so it's interesting when you talk about the racism and the inability to decenter whiteness. Like, did that not occur to them as sort of lovers of art and music and those kinds of things? Like,
absolutely not. That did not occur to them. But I would say, about that, and I'm really proud of my son for having, for being self-aware, far more discerning than I was, obviously, at his age, to bring that up, to feel comfortable enough and to feel compassionate enough to bring it up. And I also think that it's really important for us to say, as adoptees and Black adoptees and adoptees of color, like, it's cruel. It's actually cruel to raise a child of a different race surrounded by whiteness all day, every day, day in, day out. It's cruel. And I think that we have to give ourselves permission to say that.
Mm-hmm. Has anything changed with them now? Like at all? Like they
changed in what way?
Well, I'm going to guess that a big light bulb hasn't gone on in terms of, you're right.
No.
Yeah, I think I'm curious because, again, if I take it out of your parents specifically, but again, I know, rural New Hampshire and many places in New Hampshire, and a lot of folks who fancy themselves very liberal.
Sure.
In the state of New Hampshire, and in a bit of what I have observed is a cognitive dissonance between, I vote blue and I want to march in the Women's March and those kinds of things, but being really happy in a place where you can literally go weeks without seeing another non-white person or seeing a non-white person.
That part. Yeah. They live in a bubble and that's comfortable to them. And that bubble is dangerous to me, their daughter. And that they are unable to recognize that makes it really, really hard for us to have a relationship. And do I want my kid around that? No, not so much. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not the same thing as saying they didn't love me. Of course, they loved me and I love them.
All right. I think this is my last question. And I know Haley will have a closing question for us as well. Do you think that finally telling your story for yourself with your own words, has it changed you?
Yeah, it has indeed. I just feel healthier. I just feel healthier, and I feel like it's evidence of making good choices, and that for all of the questioning, I arrived at a place where I love well and have loved well, and that I have centered Blackness in a way that brings joy to my family, this family that I made and the family that I chose. Yeah, I feel healthier, emotionally healthier.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And
it's my pleasure.
I think Haley's gonna close us out with one last question.
I feel feel like I'm interrupting. I've had this pleasure of eavesdropping on this beautiful conversation. So thank you for sharing your heart with us, both of you. I really appreciate it. Okay, we love to ask people what they're reading right now. So what are you reading, Rebecca?
Well, I'm doing a conversation with Nabil Ayers, My Time in the Sun. My husband is reading it now. I just want to recommend this because it's so good. Yeah. And we have a very interesting, similar story. Again, I mean, he wasn't adopted, but this is the book, and
My life
he is the son of the jazz musician Roy Ayers, but didn't have a relationship with him. So it's interesting. He also sort of grew up in and around Cambridge and Massachusetts and Amherst, and so there's a lot of. So anyway, we're doing a public conversation at the Brooklyn Public Library in a few weeks. So I've just finished that.
Beautiful.
And I highly recommend.
Thank you. We will definitely add it to our TBR list. And before we say goodbye, I wanted to read you a couple of comments from the chat. Max says, no question, just wanted a chance to say I'm also a rural New Hampshire transracial adoptee, and the book meant so much to me. So much of it mirrored my own experiences, and it just made me feel so ungaslit for the first time in my life. Thank you. And Laura shares, I am also a TRA from Greater Boston area, and I was born in Columbia and was raised in a white suburb. Canadian. SA, was that? Is that a state? Columbia, SA? I'm not sure.
Where is this person?
Laura?
South America.
Columbia, South America.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Thank you. Born in Columbia, South America, was raised in a white suburb and can relate to a lot of the issues in the book. I recommended it to other transracial adoptees. Thank you for allowing me to feel seen, heard, and validated. I loved it. So thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us. Yeah,
my pleasure.
Wonderful. So for everyone else who is here with us live, we always hang out a little after to just chat about the book and talk a little more about adoptee reading. So you are welcome to hang out a little later if you'd like. And for those of you who are not here live, we're going to say goodbye to you now. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much, Sullivan, for those amazing questions, for
really good.
Beautiful interview. It was just an honor to hear you shine in this way. Thank you, ladies. I am so honored that we get to host live events like these for fellow adoptees, and lots of people come to book club who have not read the book. That is not a requirement. We have fruitful and rich discussions. We usually hang out afterwards, sometimes with the author, sometimes not, and talk more about the book and what it meant to us personally, or just chit chat about adoptee stuff, which is such an honor to be invited in for those conversations. And I want to thank Sullivan Summer for hosting our book club for this month, for that October 2022 discussion. And I have links to her Instagram in the show notes if you want to follow along with her and see what else she's reading and what she's up to this year. And of course, Rebecca Carroll and all of her amazing projects. We'll have links to those things in the show notes as well. Did you know she is also a podcaster? She's got a couple of shows out you can listen to. I will make sure to have those in the show notes for you. Thank you so much for listening, and we will be back with a regular episode next week. So let's talk again then.